Okay, so you want to own a coffee shop. Exposed brick, warm lighting, the hiss of the steam wand, a chalkboard menu, regulars who know your order before you say it. That's the picture in your head. You imagine yourself behind the counter on a slow Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, watching the till fill up one $4 latte at a time. Here's the problem. That picture is doing a lot of work to hide what this business actually is. Let's start with the illusion, because the illusion is the entire reason this industry keeps pulling people in. The beverage itself is one of the highest margin products in all of retail. A cup of drip coffee can carry a gross margin north of 80%. An espresso drink isn't far behind. Numbers like that make a normal person think, this is basically printing money. But margin on a single cup and profit on a whole business are two completely different numbers, and almost nobody walks in understanding the gap between them. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly where that gap comes from, and why roughly 60% of coffee shops don't make it past their 5th year. Let's start with what you're actually buying into, because coffee shop isn't one business. It's at least 4 different businesses wearing the same apron. There's the cart or kiosk, a small footprint in a mall or office lobby, the cheapest way in the door. There's the small format café, limited seating, a focused menu, built for speed. There's the full sit-down shop with a real kitchen and a food program. And there's the drive-through, no seating at all, built entirely around how fast you can get a car through a window. Each one is a completely different bet on how people actually behave, and that bet determines almost everything else about the business. Now let's talk about what it costs to get through the door, because this is where the fantasy usually dies. A small kiosk or cart can get you in for somewhere between $25,000 and $75,000. A full cafe with seating typically runs $150,000 to $250,000. A drive-through, because of the site work and specialized equipment, usually starts around $250,000 and can push past $400,000. Build-out alone runs $75 to $150 per square foot before you've bought a single espresso machine. And speaking of the machine, a proper commercial unit runs $5,000 to $20,000 on its own, before grinders, ice machines, refrigeration, and a point-of-sale system. Here's the part nobody budgets for correctly: working capital. Most new coffee shops take somewhere between 18 and 36 months to reach profitability. That's not a typo. Up to 3 years. Which means before you've proven the concept works, you need enough cash reserved just to survive the runway. Typically another $60,000 to $100,000 on top of the build-out, sitting there purely to cover the gap between opening the doors and actually turning a profit. So you've spent your capital, you've opened the doors, and the espresso machine is finally hissing. Here's where the whole picture flips, because the money isn't where you think it is. Everyone assumes the coffee itself is the product. That assumption is only half right. Yes, a cup of coffee carries close to 80% gross margin, but gross margin only pays for the ingredients. It says nothing about the rent, the labor, the insurance, the card processing fees, and the 1,000 small costs that show up after the drink is already out the door. Once all of that gets subtracted, that 80% gross margin on a single cup collapses down to a net margin of somewhere between 2.5% and 10% for the business as a whole. Some of the best-run independent shops push past that into the mid-teens. Most don't get close. So if the coffee itself barely clears single digits after everything is accounted for, how does anyone make real money doing this? 3 places, and almost none of them are on the drink menu. The first is the food and retail attachment. Pastries sourced from a wholesale bakery carry 50 to 60% margins. A bag of retail beans, the kind sitting by the register, carries 55 to 65% margin and costs the shop about 30 seconds of labor to sell. Shops with a real retail program, beans, merchandise, brewing equipment, consistently run 2 to 4 percentage points better on their blended margin than shops that only sell drinks. The second is frequency, not customers. This is the part almost nobody outside the industry thinks about. A regular who comes in 12 times a month at $7 a visit is worth more to the business than a tourist who wanders in once and drops $22. Not because the total spend is higher, it usually isn't, but because the cost of acquiring that regular customer gets spread across 144 visits a year instead of 1. Shops that run a real loyalty program see something like 2.3 times the visit frequency and close to 20% higher average ticket size compared to shops that don't. The forgotten punch card, in other words, might be the single most valuable piece of paper in the building. The third is throughput, how many drinks you can put out per labor hour. Because here's the trap that catches almost every first-time owner. Labor is the single largest controllable expense in this business, typically 30 to 40% of revenue. A shop with a slow, bottlenecked bar loses money on every rush hour even while the line is out the door, because you're paying the same wages whether you're making 12 drinks an hour or 30. The best-run shops obsess over this number specifically, drinks per labor hour, the way a dealership obsesses over inventory turn or a gym obsesses over churn. Now, the hidden costs, the ones that don't show up on the equipment invoice. Occupancy is the big one. A coffee shop paying $8,000 a month in rent needs to sell dramatically more drinks per day just to break even than an identical shop paying $3,000. And that gap in rent flows directly into the gap in margin, month after month, whether business is good or bad. Then there's the coffee itself as a commodity. Arabica bean prices doubled between January 2024 and January 2025 alone, spiking 25% in a single month at one point. That's not a controllable cost. That's global weather and global supply chains showing up on your P&L, whether you like it or not. Let's talk about how this actually breaks, using a real example instead of a hypothetical one. Compass Coffee opened in Washington, D.C. in 2014, built a loyal following, and grew to 25 locations across D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. Genuinely one of the more successful independent coffee brands in the country, often described as a real challenger to Starbucks in its home market. In January of 2026, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Court filings showed close to $11.7 million owed to creditors and investors. The company cited persistent low foot traffic in the years after the pandemic. Within weeks, it had closed 10 locations and terminated those leases outright. Its roasting facility, the production hub behind every one of those stores, shut down as part of the restructuring. The remaining 17 locations survived only because a London-based chain placed a stalking horse bid of $2.9 million to acquire what was left of the brand. Read those two numbers again: 25 thriving locations, then $11.7 million in debt, and a $2.9 million sale price for what remained. That's not a story about bad coffee. Compass Coffee was, by every account, good coffee, in good locations, with a loyal following. It's a story about a cost structure, rent, debt service, wages, that was built assuming a certain level of foot traffic, and when that foot traffic shifted even modestly in a changed post-pandemic landscape, the entire structure didn't bend, it broke. The lesson isn't unique to Compass. It happens across this industry constantly, quietly, one lease termination at a time, without ever making national news beyond a single trade article. So who actually wins in this business? Not usually the single location dreamer with the exposed brick and the chalkboard menu. It's the operators who stack advantages the way a franchise dealership or a multi-property landlord does. In-house roasting is one of the biggest levers. A roaster typically pays for itself within 6 to 12 months through a 30 to 50% reduction in coffee costs, plus the ability to charge a premium for something the shop next door can't offer. Multi-unit operators spread fixed costs like accounting, marketing, and management across several locations, instead of forcing one store to absorb all of it alone. And the operators who treat the loyalty program and the retail shelf as core parts of the business, not an afterthought by the register, are the ones who consistently land in that 15 to 20% net margin tier instead of the 2.5%. Now let's put it together and look at a single year two ways. In the optimistic scenario, you've picked a location with real walk-by traffic, kept your build-out disciplined instead of over-designed, built a loyalty base that visits regularly, and added a retail and food program that pulls its weight. A small format independent cafe in that position can generate somewhere between $325,000 and $550,000 a year in revenue, with a net margin in the 10 to 20% range. That's a real business, and a real living. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 ordinary things go wrong. Bean prices spike the way they did in 2024. A new shop opens 2 blocks away and splits the regulars you were counting on. Labor costs rise 5 to 7%, which they typically do every year, and your throughput doesn't improve to compensate. Under those conditions, that same shop can slide from a comfortable double-digit margin down into low single digits, or into an outright loss during a slow season, while the espresso machine is still hissing every morning, and the shop still looks, from the sidewalk, exactly as busy as it did the year before. That's the part that catches owners off guard every time. A full parking lot, a full dining room, a line out the door. None of it tells you whether the business underneath is actually healthy. So is it worth it? This isn't a business where a great cup of coffee is enough. It demands real capital before you sell a single drink, patience through up to 3 years of thin or negative margins, and a level of operational discipline around labor, around throughput, around retail attachment that has almost nothing to do with why most people fall in love with coffee in the first place. But for the operators who treat it as what it actually is, a low-margin, high-frequency, deeply operational business that happens to sell something people crave every single morning, it can be one of the most resilient small businesses in the entire economy. The coffee was never really the product. It was the reason someone walked through the door in the first place.